Welcome everyone, so glad you're joining us for this explainer today. We are going to unpack the massive systemic impacts of the 2026 Middle East crisis. Now, as students of political science, you already know that modern conflicts rarely ever stay confined to their own borders. Today, we're maintaining a strictly objective, analytical lens to explore not just the primary theater of this conflict, but the huge, often ignored geopolitical and economic shockwaves that are currently destabilizing the Horn of Africa. We're going to map out exactly how a crisis in one region threatens the very survival of nations thousands of miles away.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're covering the fragile 60-day memorandum, the leadership variable, global trade choke points, the destabilization in the African Horn, Kenya's specific security dilemma, and finally, we'll wrap up with a predictive matrix mapping this whole domino effect.
Let's start with Section 1, the fragile 60-day memorandum, the state of play as of May 29, 2026.
First, we really need to set the scene here. This current geopolitical stalemate, it is merely a precarious pause, definitely not a permanent peace. To understand why, just look at the sheer velocity of how this all escalated. Back on February 28th, the crisis ignited when surprise U.S. and Israeli airstrikes resulted in the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. By March, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, assumed power. Then in April, after historic talks essentially blew up in Islamabad, the U.S. imposed a crippling naval blockade that was costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day. And now, in late May, we've managed to reach this tentative 60-day Memorandum of Understanding. This framework pauses the blockade and lifts restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz, but literally just to allow a 60-day window for nuclear negotiations. The core underlying issues are still entirely unresolved.
So why do those historic Islamabad talks completely collapse after 21 grueling hours? Well, it all comes down to a singular, intractable roadblock. The United States has a very clear core demand. Iran's stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium simply must physically leave the country. But Iran's stance is an absolute direct refusal to export any of that uranium. It's fascinating. They actually agreed on almost every other point of a 10-point ceasefire, but on the nuclear issue, they totally collided. The U.S. called Iran unyielding, while Iran fired back about maximalist demands. And you know, right there, that is exactly the friction point where diplomacy dies.
Moving right along to Section 2, the leadership variable, we'll look at Mojtaba Khamenei's ideological shift. To really grasp why Iran is holding so firmly to its nuclear stockpile, we absolutely have to examine the most unpredictable variable in this entire crisis, a profound ideological shift in leadership. You see, the previous regime, under Ali Khamenei, sure, it was deeply adversarial to the West, but it was also known to engage in pragmatic diplomacy and highly calculated policy maneuvers when their survival required it. Contrast that with Mojtaba's new regime. Installed in March, the 56-year-old cleric has heavy backing from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. His regime is marked by a much more radical ideological stance and a completely uncompromising nuclear posture. That pragmatism of the past, it's been entirely replaced by a hardline absolutism. Now, what's really interesting about this next point is the psychological profile we're dealing with here. It's pretty chilling. Listen to this assessment from a former Iranian regime operative describing the new supreme leader. They stated, "He thinks there are milestones on the path to the end of the world, and he himself will have a special part in hastening humanity down that path." The operative literally concludes that Mojtaba is more dangerous than 50 nuclear bombs. I mean, wow. This isn't just standard political rhetoric. This is an apocalyptic worldview that fundamentally scrambles the strategic calculus of every nation at the negotiating table.
And we are already seeing this worldview materialize into concrete policy through Mojtaba's nuclear directive. This is a non-negotiable IRGC-backed mandate explicitly forbidding the export of Iran's enriched uranium. Because the IRGC has historically pushed for developing nuclear weapons, this directive has the international community deeply on edge. And as long as this absolute mandate stays in place, it directly contradicts that core U.S. demand. It functions as the primary systemic roadblock to this 60-day memorandum actually succeeding.
Okay. Let's pivot to Section 3, Global Choke Points, the economic weaponization of geography.
Let's zoom out from the negotiation table for a second and look at the macroeconomic fallout. Because when diplomacy fails, geography literally becomes a weapon. Think about this. 20% of the entire global oil and gas supply transits through a single narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran retaliated in early 2026, they blocked this strait and even threatened the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which handles another 15% of global trade. Global oil prices and trade volumes started fluctuating wildly, purely based on the weaponization of these maritime choke points.
Basically, whoever has the power to close these straits essentially holds the entire global economy hostage.
And the cost of that hostage situation is astronomical, $10 billion. To put that into perspective, this specific number tells two distinct, totally devastating stories in this crisis. First, $10 billion represents the estimated daily value to global markets of just keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. Imagine losing that every single day. But secondly, it represents the catastrophic revenue loss that Egypt has already suffered at the Suez Canal due to the ongoing Red Sea crisis. That is $10 billion violently drained from an already vulnerable North African economy.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, African Horn Destabilization, the hidden contagion effect.
Let's move to see how this builds, because this is a massive, incredibly vital angle that almost everyone ignores. The economic contagion threatening East Africa. If you want to understand regional security, you have to follow this causal chain. Step 1. Iranian missiles target Gulf states. Step 2. As a direct result, huge diaspora populations from Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea working in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE face severe physical danger and mass deportation. Step 3. Those workers are forced home, meaning these horn nations suddenly lose billions in vital remittances. Step 4. The sudden influx of returning migrants, combined with vanishing income, totally crashes the fragile horn economies. And Step 5. In Somalia, a country already fighting a war it didn't start, this economic shock allows the insurgent group Al-Shabaab to rapidly expand and gain ground.
Naturally, in response to this destabilization, regional realignments are happening fast. Take the recent security pact between Somalia, Eritrea, and Egypt, formed to defend against Red Sea instability. But if we dig a little deeper, there's a glaring underlying weakness here. Remember that $10 billion Suez loss we just talked about? Egypt's economy is experiencing a hidden collapse. They are essentially buying regional relevance on borrowed time, relying heavily on cash injections from the UAE and Qatar. Because of that, a lot of analysts are looking at this pact and increasingly describing it as a highly unsustainable alliance of convenience.
Let's shift focus to Section 5, Kenya's security dilemma, caught in the crossfire. It isn't just the Red Sea coast feeling the heat either. Further south, Nairobi is walking a seriously precarious diplomatic and military tightrope. And this begs a vital, fascinating question for us political scientists. How exactly do peripheral nations become entangled in superpower conflicts? Like, why is Kenya emerging as a prime retaliatory target in a war that is centered all the way up in the Middle East?
And this brilliantly illustrates the whole danger of unintended consequences and strategic alliances in a polarized world. Look at the facts. Kenya hosts highly strategic US and UK military bases. On top of that, Kenya's leadership selectively condemned the Iranian strikes on Gulf neighbors, but they very pointedly refused to condemn the initial US and Israeli attacks on Iran. So, by picking a diplomatic side, while simultaneously hosting Western military infrastructure, Nairobi has inadvertently painted a huge bullseye on itself, completely exposing the country to asymmetrical retaliation.
Finally, Section 6, the predictive matrix. Let's look at 4 potential scenarios.
All right, we've mapped out all the variables: the nuclear impasse, the radical leadership shift, the trade choke points, and regional vulnerabilities. Synthesizing all of this into a rigorous matrix yields 4 probable outcomes for the coming months. At 30%, the MOU actually holds, oil stabilizes, and remittances in the Horn slowly recover. At 20%, we sink into a prolonged frozen conflict with chronic, agonizing economic bleeding across East Africa. At 15%, we have the absolute worst-case scenario, a nuclear breakout by Iran triggering a complete and total Red Sea shutdown. But the highest statistical probability, sitting at 35%, is that the MOU collapses entirely and war resumes. Iran refuses to export uranium, the blockade tightens, global food prices could surge up to 60%, and Somalia completely destabilizes.
So the crucial point we need to walk away with is this. The war has only technically paused. That 60-day window is rapidly ticking down, and the core issues remain completely, 100% unresolved. What's it going to be? Will it be Mojtaba's flat-out refusal to ship out enriched uranium? Will it be the catastrophic economic leverage of shutting the Strait of Hormuz? Or will a resurgence of conflict in Gaza collapse the ceasefire entirely? Which of these 3 deal breakers will be the spark that finally pushes our global stability over the precipice? Thank you all so much for joining this explainer. I really hope this analytical framework helps you make sense of the critical days ahead.